Good day, everybody, and welcome to the sixth session of the 2022 Asian Evaluation Week. I am Véronique Salze-Lozac'h. I am the head of evaluation at EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So it's yet another virtual meeting, but I wanted to mention that in the last few days, everything I kept receiving on my social media or on my phone were about memories from AEW years back. So from Xi'an in 7 years ago, then from Hongsu, from Kunming. So all great memories. But it reminded me also that even though the last 3 years have been virtual, we can really congratulate the organizers and thank them for being able to continue business. And they haven't stopped doing this event and giving us this opportunity to share knowledge and to come together in September every year to talk about evaluation. So thank you very much to the organizers, to the Ministry of Finance of the People's Republic of China, to AFDI, and also to the Independent Evaluation Department at the Asian Development Bank. So thank you for that. The session today is entitled Evaluations in Times of Crisis. So what have we learned in the past 2 years? It's normal for evaluators to look back and try to see what happened. And we can say that the COVID-19 pandemic and then now the outburst also of the war on Ukraine has really pushed independent evaluation departments to rethink how they could be relevant, how they could be useful to board members, to the institution, to operation. And it's important that we learn also that to continue to remain relevant and to be impactful, we had to adapt and we had to innovate. And it's time now to take stock, to stop and look back and try to see what we learned from this last, a little bit more than 2 years of evaluation in times of crisis. And to do that today, I'm lucky to be accompanied by distinguished panelists. First, we will have a presentation by my colleague, Gabriele Fattorelli, who is the director of the Corporate and Thematic Division at the Independent Evaluation Department of EBRD. So thank you, Gabriele. And we'll have 4 panelists. Eva Cassel, who is representing the board, or at least as a board member from the EBRD. And thank you very much, Eva, for being here with us. Eva is the board member of EBRD. She's also vice chair of the audit committee, which is the committee to which independent evaluation reports, and also a very strong advocate of independent evaluation and evidence-based information. So thank you, Eva, again, for being here with us. We also have Megan Grace Kennedy-Chouane. Hello, who is the head of evaluation at the Development Cooperation Directorate at OECD. And Megan has been very active in building coalitions and bringing evaluators together from the very start of COVID-19. And she will tell us more about it in a few minutes. And 2 dear colleagues, Charles Collyns, who is at the head of the Independent Evaluation Department of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and Emmanuel Jimenez, who is a Director General of Independent Evaluation at the Asian Development Bank. So thank you all for being here, and Charles particularly for being up so early in the morning, joining us from the US. So I will now leave the floor to Gabriele, who will present you the experience of independent evaluation in EBRD and the key lessons that we draw from that experience. So to you, Gabriele.
Many thanks, Véronique. Can you hear me? Great. So it's really great to be here. Before I start, let me also thank and congratulate as well the organizer of this year Asian Evaluation Week. I attended very early this morning a couple of sessions. I found them extremely inspiring and stimulating. So many thanks and congratulations from my side too. Coming to the presentation, as you were saying, Véronique, over the last 2 years, we at the Independent Evaluation Department of the EBRD, we often found ourselves in the position to adjust, to adapt to the multiple crises affecting the region and our client. As you mentioned, not just the COVID-19 pandemic, but the war in Ukraine, and of course the climate change crisis, which has a repercussion on all what we do. So the very short presentation I prepared aimed to summarize what we have learned, and hopefully it may provide some food for thought for the discussion you will have afterwards with the panelists. So first slide, what we have learned in these 2 years. The need to keep on innovating. If evaluation wants to remain relevant in terms of crisis, must innovate at maybe a faster pace of what we have done up to now in terms of product, methodologies, techniques, approaches, and so on. That became a necessity in the COVID times. We needed to find a way to gather evaluation remotely and so on. So we started using artificial intelligence, big data, data mining in a more structural way. And along with other evaluation departments across the MDB system, we also experiment a new kind of product, near real-time evaluation, real-time assessment. And there is clearly a need here to, among evaluators, to sit together and to identify common methodologies and definition that may put us on the same page when we develop this kind of product. Also in EBRD, we launched our very first rapid assessment that help us to become more agile and innovative and to adapt to the changing circumstances. So this rapid assessment was about the EBRD COVID-19 response. And it was particularly innovative, I believe, not just in terms of the content, but also in terms of the approach. We delivered this product in just 6 months. And the particular way we did it was not just to look at the findings in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, but very much in the context of a broader crisis, trying to attempt to answer the questions, how well the EBRD fulfill its mandate of fostering transition in a crisis situation. It also became a sort of platform, if I may say so, to share more and to engage more substantially with other evaluation departments, for example, with a global coalition led by Megan this year. And also, I can mention that the lead evaluator of this rapid assessment is now in a secondment at the Office of Evaluation at the IMF, in your office, Charles, and she's contributing to the IMF evaluation of the COVID-19 pandemic response. So I guess a very brilliant example of collaboration and learning between offices. Second lesson is about the need of flexibility. In time of crisis, it's very important in order to maximize the utility of the evaluation function, to embed in our work program a high degree of flexibility, to accommodate the new priorities, new demands, but that should not come to the detriment of the evaluation work related to the corporate strategic longer-term priorities and objectives of the institutions. So we built in our work program crisis lens through other important strategic priorities of the EBRD, supporting the green transition, promoting gender inclusion, accelerating digitalization, strengthening result management. And we also complemented that with specific product related to the crisis. We will deliver this year the very first impact assessment based on a counterfactual analysis of the EBRD COVID-19 response. And next year, we will hopefully deliver the very first real-time evaluation about the second crisis package of the EBRD in support to Ukraine. So to summarize it, timely adjustment of the work program is important to accommodate the new priorities, but it's also important not to lose track of longer-term priorities and ensure good resource management to deliver upon this flexibility. Third, the focus on learning. It's very important in time of crisis to strengthen and sharpen our learning approach in order to maximize evaluation use and usefulness. We needed to remember, though, that there is a very important learning dimension stemming from the accountability side of evaluation. So there is no dichotomy here between these two sides. The focus on learning should underpin the whole project cycle, and evaluation needs to put in place rapid learning loops that may improve and refine the blueprints of crisis intervention, which by necessity are designed very quickly and disperse very rapidly. And secondly, it's essential to derive a lesson from this implementation and identify suitable ways to share them within the institution and more broadly across other institutions. That's why, for example, that the role of a partnership such as the Global Coalition was very important in the context of the pandemic. Maybe I can just provide very quickly a quick example, getting back to our rapid assessment of the EBRD response to the pandemic. As I was saying, this rapid assessment was very informative by nature. We didn't include any prescriptive recommendation, but several concrete, well-substantiated insights and lessons. And those lessons have been taken on board very eagerly by management with the guidance of the board. And Eva, who was one of the main engines behind that, maybe you can say a few words about that later. So two quick examples. So the first EBRD response to the COVID-19 was designed essentially for existing clients. And our work shed a light on that, showing that there was very much a missing opportunity not to provide a broader support to the whole private sector in our countries of operation. So the second crisis-related package for Ukraine, for example, it's now open to any business in the country and also in other potentially affected countries in our portfolio. Second, the COVID-19 response was not really taking stock of the learning, and the bank was very rapid in setting up this response to the pandemic, but it didn't maybe become enough agile because of the lack of learning. So it was very reassuring that in the Ukraine package, in the second crisis-related package of the EBRD, there is the establishment of regular mechanisms to get ongoing feedback from clients and operations. And congratulations to the EBRD management and the board on a very good example of learning from past experience. And I finish here, just maybe summarize again these three, next slide please, these three key lessons that I wanted to share. Agility and innovation, flexibility and balance between shorter-term needs and longer-term priorities, and focus on learning, but very importantly, without dropping the accountability side. And yeah, maybe before I finish, the next slide, please, maybe before I finish, I can just put on the table a few questions that are the kind of questions that we evaluators usually ask ourselves. What else there is there to learn? What can we do better? What does it mean looking forward? And the list can keep on going, of course. And but maybe I can stop here and get back to you, Véronique, to get some answer from our panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gabriele, for this presentation and these examples and cases. I think it's really a great starting point for the discussion we're going to have among our panelists. So for the discussion itself, I propose to have 2 rounds of questions. So I will go around the panelists and ask 1 question per panelist, and then we'll have some time for question and answers from the question from the audience, answers from the panelists. Then we'll go to the second round, and again, question and answers in the second round. So if you have questions also about the presentation or related to the question that Gabriele raised, please write them also together with the other questions on the Q&A space, and we will go to them in between 2 rounds. The first round, we will focus on lessons learned. So it would be really looking at the experience of the last 2 years and see what really emerges from our various experiences and from the different perspectives. And the second round will be more about looking forward. So what? What have we learned? Okay, but what are we going to do with this? And how do we think it's going to improve the way we do evaluation also for the future, and in case of future crisis? So I will right away turn to the first panelist, Manny, because I would like to have your experience that's in a way similar, but in many ways also different from what we've done at EVD in EBRD. ADB and the Independent Evaluation Department in ADB were among the first, if not the first, to get started on having a real-time assessment of the COVID-19 crisis. So I would like to have your perspective about where the key characteristics of that work, how has it evolved, and what are the key lessons that you can draw from that experience.
Thanks
so
a lot.
You, Manny.
Thanks a lot, Véronique, and it's a special honor for me to have been invited by you to answer questions to which you know the answer better than I do because of your experience having been in IED. In fact, when it started, these real-time evaluations. So as Véronique mentioned, IED produced a series of reports. They call them real-time evaluations during what seemed to me a very unreal time in March of 2020. And these reports were aimed to provide the bank, board, and management an independent assessments of ADB's very large COVID response to help the developing member countries. There were 4 reports over a 1.5-year period, approximately one every quarter or so, and a capstone report is being prepared now. Perhaps it's best to characterize these by quoting one of the co-authors who said that, quote, perhaps it's closer to monitoring than evaluation, but monitoring with a heavy dose of analysis. In order to speed up processes, we kept the report short and confidential. We reduced the internal commenting period, and we did not offer recommendations, unquote. So these are just some interesting characteristics. I also want to note that some of the reports had a special topic. For example, the last report that was done in real time was about the ADB support for the private sector, what ADB calls non-sovereign operations, and how more challenged ADB was compared to other multilaterals in ramping up support to countries. So what lessons can be learned? Just very briefly, let me just mention 2. One on use and one on methods. So in use, I think like Gabriele mentioned, there was general support for these reports. They were popular with both board and management, perhaps because they didn't have any recommendations that that could be tracked, and many called for more work of this nature. We can't tell you exactly, of course, what the impact of these RTEs, or real-time evaluations, have been. But I think that one perspective is that it helped to provide an independent assurance that the ADB was on the right track. Because ADB was, unlike the management report, was able to elicit voices from constituents and other stakeholders that management was not drawing. So the lesson for me here on use is that before we start out, there's really a need to ensure greater clarity and consensus among the stakeholders on what do you expect from these reports. But in a way, these are very reactive, quick response, and I don't think that conversation really took place. And what we saw was what we got. So, second on methods. Unlike in thematic evaluations, when criteria are set, and Megan is here, so we followed very carefully, of course, the OECD DAC criteria, and there is a certain set way of doing portfolio analysis. Here, the methods used, and Gabriele alluded to this, were less clearly defined from the start. There was no accepted methodology for how these real-time evaluations were going to be done. And in fact, there was some concern among our constituents, both management and indeed some board members, to say that were we going beyond our ordinary remit by looking at things that were really you couldn't get impact assessments for. So the lesson for me, and this is something Gabriele alluded to, is that it really would be helpful to develop guidelines to enhance the credibility of these RTEs and even more importantly, actually, to share our experiences like we're doing now among all of the multilaterals and other organizations that have done these on what methodologies seem to work, what were more credible relative to others. For example, on guidelines, we don't really have any criteria, and we didn't test effectiveness, but we're really looking at is inferring effectiveness from the theories of change. I think it would really be helpful to have a conversation on what is a set methodology for that. So just a couple of lessons from me on use and on the methods. Back to you, Véronique. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manny. And actually the key lesson that we still have to learn quite a lot and reflect on what worked and what didn't work. But really good point also on the fact that among evaluators, it's time also to start a discussion also about our role and how we can maybe continue to be reactive to some of the crises, but without losing track of the methodology, without maybe undermining also the rigorous analysis that we need to bring to our audiences. I'll turn to Eva now, because Eva, you were in the shoes of the board members receiving this information. Manny mentioned that there is a lot of support now for this type of exercise. I can say, not for EBRD, but for ADB, that it was not a given at the beginning. And because there were, and rightly so, there were some reticences from management. You know, like we are already in the middle of a crisis, so evaluation is going to add more work when it's really not time to do that. And some board members were also feeling the same, say, is it really the time and the place for evaluation to be really active? I suppose that this type of conversation also went on in EBRD. But from your perspective now, 2 years later, you know, what can you say about, you know, the way evaluation responded maybe to your demand about evidence of what EBRD was doing to respond to the COVID-19 crisis? You know, what are the key lessons that you can draw also, and how did you react to this, to the reports that were brought to you?
Thank you, Véronique, and I would like to start just by saying how happy I am to join you here in the Asian Evaluation Week. This is my second year, and I'm extremely pleased to participate in such a well-organized event with so many interesting and topical issues on the agenda. But going back to the questions from Véronique, I recall very vividly actually the first time you mentioned the concept of rapid assessments, and already at that point of time, and that it was some time before it was actually launched here in the EBRD. I thought it was absolutely a splendid idea, very attractive and interesting, and I would say that most of my colleagues in the board had the same feeling once they heard about it the first time, because it's clear from a board perspective the potential of the rapid assessments to give us much needed feedback and input for further decision making. We all know that the crisis is characterized by not having full information of the situation in place, not knowing how the situation will evolve, and we are knowing much even less about what kind of actions will actually be fruitful and successful. So here, the need for being agile, flexible, and learning as you are going is more important than ever. I think that's the huge attraction for a decision maker to have those rapid assessment and feedback loops, because they could fill some of those gaps. Early information is much needed. What worked well, less well, what do we need to keep an eye on, and what could we or should we actually change going forward? And I would argue that our experience from the rapid assessments of the COVID response program here in the EBRD was very, very good. But added to that, and a little bit unexpectedly for me, we very quickly and sadly entered a new black chapter, a new crisis caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And that called for a new crisis response. And then we also had some very useful lessons learned, more generic ones, on how we responded to the other crisis and what have we learned for this next crisis coming so unexpectedly and so quickly upon us after the COVID crisis. And Gabriele was telling you a little bit about it, and the board actually had very concrete use of the lessons learned from the crisis response to the COVID crisis. So that is an additional good feature to the rapid assessments that we had. Thanks, Véronique.
Thank you
for the time being.
Thank you, Eva. Yes, it was also in a way deliberate to make sure that the lessons from the COVID-19 response were broad enough that they wouldn't be limited to just a COVID-19 response, because unfortunately we didn't know what crisis was coming. Unfortunately, it came too fast, but we unfortunately know that there will be more crises. I will turn to you, Charles, because in IMF you had a different approach, and I would like you to share that approach and also share your experience in IMF, please.
Thanks very much, Véronique. And I have to say it's very nice to be participating again in the Asia Evaluation Week, even if it's only virtually rather than on the ground. You said that the IMF had a somewhat different approach, but actually I was very much struck by a lot of resonance of the themes that have already been mentioned with our own experience. And we've mentioned two aspects in particular, which were stressed by Gabriele, which were also very much themes that we ourselves were seeking to achieve in our own evaluation work. First, we also wanted to move nimbly and quickly to provide early lessons to management, staff, and the board, much more quickly than, in fact, we have responded in previous crises. We've typically done evaluation of the impacts of major crises, of global financial crisis, the euro area crisis. But our approach in the past has been to do retrospective, in-depth, comprehensive assessments a few years after. So the assessment of the response to the global financial crisis was something like 6 years later. We thought we needed to move much more quickly and nimbly on this occasion for the reasons that you all have already described. And I have to say that our board was extremely happy to hear that we would be moving much more quickly than we had in the past. We adopted also a two-stage approach as at the EBRD, a first evaluation focusing on the emergency phase of the fund's response to the pandemic, mainly the first 3 months, but taking into account what happened through the first year, and then coming back in 3 or 4 years for a more standard, comprehensive retrospective, where we can take into account the longer-term consequences of the crisis response. We also innovated further, and for the first time, we had a midpoint engagement with our board to have a discussion with the board on the early findings as they were being developed, rather than waiting for the full written set of documents with fact checking and quality control, et cetera. And again, I think this was an innovation that was very much welcomed by the board in giving them a chance to grapple with some of the issues that we were identifying. And it also was very helpful to us because we then were able to get reactions from board management and staff to our early experience. And then the second point I wanted to make, and again, this resonates with what I've already heard, is the emphasis that we've been putting on the importance of collaboration. Collaboration between the fund and partner organizations, and the collaboration among evaluators in assessing how well our institution has worked with partners. So this is a theme we've been highlighting in recent years in a number of our evaluations. But on this particular occasion, I think we've gone considerably further than we have in the past in having frequent and contact with other evaluation offices, learning from what they themselves are doing, and exchanging information and ideas and frankly conclusions. I think it's been particularly important on this occasion, but it's always quite important for the fund to make sure that it's working well with partners, to make sure there are coherent approaches to providing financing to countries. Since the IMF only fills part of a country's financing gap, it's important that the fund have a catalytic role. And I think a key question for the fund is how to maximize that catalytic role. So we've really put a lot of attention on this aspect, and I have to say we've really benefited from the fact that, I'd say fortuitously, EBRD was very kind enough to suggest that we have a secondment from Natalia Krieg of the EBRD, who had worked on the rapid assessment at the EBRD and is now very much working with us and helping us put together our evaluation. So I would really encourage this sort of cross-institutional fertilization as a very nice innovation that certainly will help us and hopefully will also be very helpful to the EBRD. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Charles, and we are really delighted also with this possibility of collaboration. I think we really learned a lot on both sides. It's important that you are stressing the word collaboration, and that really leads me to the next panelist, because Megan is the one who has been from the beginning of COVID-19 stressing the fact that we needed to collaborate more and that we needed also to joint efforts. So Megan, could you tell us more about this initiative and what came out of it?
Yes, gladly. Thank you. And thank you to the colleagues for organizing today's event, and to our hosts of Asian Evaluation Week for persisting with these important exchanges despite the difficult circumstance and the fact that the pandemic remains an ongoing challenge for all of us. So I resonate with many of the points that have been shared. Just to share briefly then, the COVID-19 Global Evaluation Coalition was formed in June officially, but we really started discussing it already in April of 2020. And it grew out of a sense that, like many crises, and in fact, sustainable development as a global challenge, this is a global challenge that all evaluation units and all governments face. So we've seen throughout the past several years that all governments are struggling to use evidence effectively for policy making, and that all governments could do better to properly evaluate the impacts, including key questions around differential results across populations. So I sit within the OECD, where we serve as the Secretariat for the OECD DAC Network on Development Evaluation. You see many of our fine members amongst us today, but we have two sister networks, the United Nations Evaluation Group, as well as the Evaluation Cooperation Group, the ECG. And in early spring of 2020, we realized each of us were responding to requests from our members. And we thought, it really makes very little sense for us to each run off and do our own thing. Let's try to join forces. And get outside of our normal silos of these different constituencies. And we also brought in what I call the fourth leg of that table, which is the evaluation units within partner country governments. And to me, that is a really critical, important part of what makes the work of the COVID Coalition different from other types of collaboration that we've been involved in over the last couple of decades as the EvalNet. We've accomplished a lot during this period, and we actually still have a lot of exciting work that's on the table today. We did early on a Lessons from Evaluation series, which tried to feed in a very quick way into ministerial meetings that were happening about the COVID response. And those meetings were thematic. So we would find out often only 2 weeks or 3 weeks ahead of time that the ministers were meeting on food security. And we very rapidly mobilized all of the members of the coalition to pull out key policy messages on food security. And we found this was a rather uncomfortable thing for many evaluators. These were rapid and had a policy audience. So they were not sort of technical, high quality, systematic reviews, but they proved to be incredibly valuable. And so that's an example of some of the early work that we did to really support use of existing evidence in the COVID response. And then we've really shifted over the course of 2021 and continuing today into evaluating the response itself. And just to share one really interesting example is a joint evaluation of the protection of refugee rights during the COVID pandemic. Now, this is a joint evaluation carried out under the auspices of the COVID Coalition with leadership from the evaluation units of UNHCR, Colombia, Uganda, Finland, and with support from ALNAP. And these partners worked together to actually carry out a global evaluation, which is really unique. So we're not talking about evaluating UNHCR's response to refugee rights or the role of the Colombian government in protecting refugee rights, but we're looking at the overall global picture. And it's a very different type of evaluation, and I think really exciting. That evaluation report was launched in July of this year. You can download summaries in multiple languages on our website, and please encourage you to share those findings with colleagues. There's some really important messages there about gender equality, protection from violence, and also around children's rights and protection issues. And then now we've launched, of course, a whole new area of evaluation going forward, which is around evaluating the overall response. And again, this will be looking beyond the actions of any individual actors, and it's drawing on the strength of this global coalition, which is to say that Charles can tell you about whether the IMF did a good job, and Véronique can tell you about how EBRD did, and Manny can tell you about the ADB, but who's telling us about what that looked like in the Philippines and the extent to which the international development and humanitarian community effectively responded to supporting the government of the Philippines in responding to the pandemic? You know, were we worth more than the sum of our parts? So that's the focus of our current work. In addition to this overarching strategic evaluation, which will look both at the development response, the immediate health response, and support on vaccines. We will also be supporting a series of country-led evaluations. So we're working, just as one example, with the government of Burkina Faso at the moment on evaluating their national response plan. So there's still a lot happening. I invite you to visit our website and have a look. Just very quickly then, in my last moment, what lessons have we drawn from this experience? And I'll just highlight 3. I think it's really important, and I thank Véronique for taking the initiative. I think it's really important that we take the time to reflect and document these lessons. So today is a good opportunity, but there's a lot here. I mean, each one of you that's spoken, there's so much there. We should be sure that we capture it all. So my 3 lessons are: 1, we're stronger together. The credibility of the work that we've done was really improved by having the joint voice of the global evaluation community, rather than just the evaluation department of the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the EBRD, but actually doing it together was really important. We can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. As I mentioned, decision-making windows open and close quickly. And so we have to be comfortable and sometimes get out of our comfort zone to provide those just-in-time lessons. And it's better to provide with 80% certainty some good policy advice than to provide no advice at all because we can't be 100% certain. And I think there's a really interesting articulation there, and that's maybe some of the points you've alluded to as well about the role of different types of evaluation, the role of different standards of evidence in a crisis context that are worth exploring. And finally, I think it's really just a call on the global evaluation community to recognize that sometimes we're not given a mandate, sometimes we need to take a mandate. And that's, I think, a really important lesson. And as we look to the future and to climate change, I think there is a mandate to be taken by the global evaluation community, who should be holding decision makers accountable for the impacts of their decisions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Megan. And that's really an impressive thing that you did over the last 2 years. I remember the first meetings, and you know, it seems kind of natural now, but it was really a hard work to bring everybody together. And I have to say that it was more difficult for IFIs like us to join the coalition because of the topics, because of many things. But we definitely support your actions. I'm really impressed by it. I will now turn to the audience, and we already have a few questions there. And the first one is about the principle of doing no harm. You know, what has been the learning, and that's from, okay, I don't have the name actually of the one who asked it, but what has been the learning in terms of the principle of doing no harm? So especially working in difficult times. So that's, you have two levels of understanding this question. Is it for evaluators of doing no harm, or is it the results from the evaluations? Maybe I will start by saying that from our evaluations, if that's actually the objective, is to see, we did look at the impact that the response to COVID-19 had, but in a short term, by also making sure that not really looking at doing no harm, but making sure that the mandate of addressing the needs of the clients of EBRD was actually not impeding the fact that EBRD also has the mission of supporting the private sector in itself. So it seems to be that that was one of the lessons that came out and suggestions that came out of our evaluation that's linked to the doing no harm principle. Megan, I see that you raised your hand.
Yes, it's an excellent question that you've asked, and I've put some thoughts in the chat. But from the very beginning, the COVID-19 Evaluation Coalition agreed to a set of common principles and values that would guide the work. And one of the first one was recognizing that in some situations, it's better to do no evaluation than to do an evaluation that risks causing harm or adding to the burden in an administrative context where, you know, everybody was overwhelmed. I think the fourth lesson, if I'd had a bit of time from this whole thing, has been that we're all humans. And so, you know, we're not some sort of robots producing widgets, but we're all also our own staff. And I remember that was very clearly in an ECG meeting in the spring of 2020, where, you know, the difference between this conflict or this crisis and other more focused and regional context of crisis was that, of course, evaluation unit staff were themselves also being impacted by lockdowns, by having children or other caregiving responsibilities. So I think, you know, we went into it very much with the recognition that we should avoid doing harm. I think it is an area that has been a bit neglected in evaluation, frankly, and requires more attention. We've seen several reviews of ethical principles and their application, which have shown a number of shortcomings. We did our own review of Afghanistan-related reports last year, and frankly, we're shocked by some of the practices that some have adopted in terms of failure to protect individuals and their personal information. So that's just one way in which evaluations can potentially cause harm. But I think viewing evaluation itself as a development intervention is an important first step. And then thinking about the human cost, we have seen it affect the appetite for evaluation. And we've seen it going in two different ways. So one is that you have people operating crisis mode, kind of saying, we've done the best we can. We don't want evaluators coming along and critiquing us and holding us to a very high standard. On the other hand, we've had members report that they've never been under such high demand. So I think it's going both ways. We're seeing more demand and at the same time concern about the results of the evaluation, as mentioned by others, the need for confidentiality and internal reporting.
Well, thank you very much, Megan. Yes, indeed, it's important as evaluators that, of course, we remain mindful of the workload of our colleagues, and we also make sure that, in another way, also that we don't jump also to strong conclusions without having enough data. So we'd be also very careful, I think, in all instances to not give recommendations per se, but to use the word of, you know, flagging or suggestion, because we were really aware also that those were early findings. You know, as Manny was saying, it was mainly to ensure that we were giving some information to the institution to see whether we were on the right track, but not jumping to conclusions. The other question is about the monitoring data, and so it's more about the collection of data for this real-time assessment or rapid assessment and evaluation. How feasible was it to have sound monitoring system and monitoring data in times of crisis ready to be rapidly assessed? Well, maybe the short answer is that they weren't, no?
If I could
So,
just
Maddie, do you want to take that
uh,
one? Yeah.
Veronique, it's a great question, and clearly, you know, these real-time evaluations, in fact, any evaluation is only as good as the database on which it can draw on. And it's a real challenge when it's a new crisis that on which that data doesn't exist. I think what this points to, though, is that we need to also, as evaluators, pay attention not just to doing evaluation, but building capacity in the countries themselves to prepare themselves for such analysis. And that capacity building element is one of the mandates of, I think, several of the evaluation units like ADB, but it's something that really should be an afterthought, because the next evaluation that we do, especially if we have to do it quickly and we can't plan for it because it's a crisis, we'll have to rely on that database. And secondly, the countries themselves need their own tools to make their own decisions based on that. So I think that this points to, I think, a lesson that we need to take forward, which is on the capacity building on evaluation.
Great point, Manny, and definitely also stressing the need for data collection. And what you are saying is true for the public sector. And you might think that it's not possible with the private sector, but they might be also for other institutions like ours in EBRD, ways to also strengthen the capacity of the private sector to collect data. And if it's not for shorter crises like COVID-19, definitely for the climate change. Okay, maybe we can already go to the next round of questions. And the next round of questions is more about looking forward, you know, so what's next. And the crisis, COVID-19 crisis, as Megan was saying, is not over. I actually got it a few weeks ago. I'm traveling to Asia, so it's still going on. And unfortunately, there are also other crises going on. And there will be new expectations maybe from board members, from our colleagues about the role of evaluation. So maybe still some expectation of short-term evidence being provided, some short learning loops. Yet we are independent evaluation departments. We need to continue to make sure that we use our SAM methodology to collect evidence for accountability as well as for learning, but also that we keep an eye on the long term, as Gabriele was showing in his presentation. So I will first turn to you, Eva, because you are on the side of the demand away from board members. What would be the demand from board members, and what would be most useful for board members between, and how can we strike this balance between short-term evaluation, rapid assessment, and more solid long-term ones?
Thank you, Véronique. Yes, indeed, the crucial questions actually, and there are indeed a lot of expectations, I would say, from my part, but also from colleagues on those rapid assessments for the present crisis. So, and I think the very good experience we had from the last crisis and your input make us demand more. So that's the disadvantage of being successful, I must say. At the same time, it is, of course, and I think everybody has more or less alluded to it, and you did it yourself, Véronique, that is extremely important to strike the right balances here, and quite a few balances to be struck. We have been talking about the rapid assessments, being able to do them without losing the evaluation department's credibility or creating future conflicts in your longer term efforts. So the right balance between lessons learned and the accountability role. also get the right balance between the effort and resources you are putting into the rapid assessments and the more traditional long-term relations of core priorities for the bank. Indeed, we can't lose sight of that. Climate agenda, green transition, gender and inclusion, which is many of the topics on the agenda for this week. So that can't be lost in the process either. So here we have to be very careful. It's also very important, and Megan was talking about it when she was replying on the do no harm question. You also touched upon it, Véronique. I think it's so important not to overwhelm and bankers and management that are themselves very stretched, involved in the day-to-day work with the crisis response, as well as keeping up the core priorities for the bank. So it's important to have a focus on key strategic issues. It's important for the format and the message that you are using, not to be unnecessarily time-consuming for those involved. But I do think my sense, at least, is that you have here in the EBRD managed to do this in a good manner. Actually, I do think that many of the ones that you were interviewing and approach for the survey you did in connection to the COVID crisis response, that they were many of them were very happy to be involved and to give their input and contribute to this structured feedback loop. And indeed, that was one of the lessons learned actually for crisis in general, that this feedback loop has to be strengthened in order for us to be more successful going forward. And finally, talking a little bit about myself and my colleagues, also the board could be fairly stretched at times of crisis. So as always, it's important, of course, for you to have the inputs and the contributions from the EBD to be timely, to be relevant, but also to be in a format that is easily accessible. And by that I mean condensed, crispy messages. And if you have more information that could be structured with more meat to the bone information for those that are interested to dig into that in a separate flow, so to say. That's a little bit what I wanted to contribute with from the decision maker. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Eva, because it's really important for us in the Independent Evaluation Department to also make sure that we are useful to you. I will now turn to Charles and ask you, Charles, about your lessons, about what you've learned on how evaluation can be most useful in IMF to use, especially for future crises.
Thanks very much, Véronique. I think that's a very good question. And also I noticed a question in the chat box about whether the fund and other evaluators should be shifting more towards real-time evaluation, providing very quick lessons and feedback to allow institutions to adapt before it's too late. Well, I have to say that at the IEO and the fund, our approach has not been to pursue real-time evaluations. That's not really our comparative advantage. We've been around for 20 years, and essentially we focus on ex-post evaluations, taking what we hope are deep, thorough, and convincing assessments, rather than moving quickly to provide sort of more instantaneous feedback. Now, instantaneous feedback has advantages, but on the other hand, it really leads to a focus on procedures rather than on bigger lessons for the institution. And I think one of the things that comes out of the current response is that it's actually very valuable to have a group like the IEO asking the the bigger questions challenging the fund, whether there are not ways to do better. I think, you know, to anticipate what our evaluations are finding, I think the fund was actually very good at responding quickly to use the existing framework to help many, many countries very, very quickly. And that's widely appreciated. But I think there are questions about whether the fund actually has the right framework in place at an institutional level to really respond most effectively to the broader group of country needs. And here I'm not talking just about the lending framework, although there are certainly lots of questions about the lending framework, but also the budgetary framework and the HR framework. And it's connecting the dots between these different institutional and corporate responses, where I think the IO can or at least has played a very valuable role, and you know, pointing to the fact that although the fund is supposed to be an institution for crises, in fact, the framework, the structure of the fund is not necessarily fit for purpose for global crises. And I think those are the bigger lessons that we can draw. And if we were spending our limited resources on more immediate micro feedback, then we wouldn't be able to play this bigger role. And it's definitely a trade-off here between how much you want to get embedded in the immediate decision-making processes and to the extent to which you can step back and draw these bigger institutional lessons, which are also important, which is not to say those bigger institutional lessons should come 5 years later. They need to come fairly quickly, but they don't need to come instantaneously. You do need some time for reflection and analysis to draw these sorts of conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. And I remember hearing one of our colleagues from the ECG, the Evaluation Cooperation Group, not long ago say that time was also the luxury of independent evaluation and that we should not lose that perspective. And I think it's also very true that actually it is a luxury in the sense that we are the department who has the capacity to stop and reflect on the past and look back and try to learn from it. And we have to find this balance between being very fast and rapid and giving, contributing to this short learning loop, and yet continuing to take this seriously, this luxury of time, of reflecting, because that's really also the core of our function. Thank you. I will turn to Manny now, and maybe Manny, I will integrate some of the questions from the audience in the question I'm asking now, because my question to you is about the experience that you had with this real-time assessment of COVID-19, but also how it impacted maybe your work in independent evaluation. Is there a before and after real-time assessment in IED? But some of the participants in the audience ask about whether real-time assessment could be mainstreamed. Do you have any feedback on that? And how have you changed in IED after this experience?
No, thanks, Véronique. And let me take your last point. And it really is a follow-on to Charles's very thoughtful remarks on whether real-time assessments or real-time evaluations, rapid assessments, whatever you want to call them, are here to stay. And I think they are. I think the real question, as you alluded to, Véronique, is does independent evaluation necessarily have to do them? And I think that's more of a question mark at this point for a couple of reasons. I think that the day-to-day monitoring of operational interventions needs to be a task of management. That's part of their job. Also, a strategic analysis of what they're doing. That's their job as well. And so there is a gray area here. It'd be interesting to get others' perspectives on where that boundary should be. And I think it's a work in progress. And I've heard board members, in fact, say that, look, why are you doing some of this? Because it gives them a disincentive to do it themselves. And so I think that's a real question. Just quickly on your other points on life after RTE, if you like, and I think there are a couple of things that will remain with us. First, on the methodology, we as Gabriele mentioned, we learn how to do things from afar, and we learn how to get data by necessity more quickly and perhaps in a less costly way, using big data instead of surveys and that sort of thing. So I think that'll be with us forever. And it's not that they're useful for everything, but it's something that we're thinking about. Secondly, formative evaluations are really challenging because it's like hitting a moving target. The interventions are ongoing. In a crisis, these targets are moving very, very rapidly indeed. And so one of the things that we're challenged with is can we ever move nimbly enough as the types of interventions keep changing? And I think that says something about our own timelines, which is why I really wonder, what that boundary is between evaluation and monitoring. Thirdly, I think that what we are going to do is really trying to convince our board to leave us more room for unprogrammed work. Now, people always say unprogrammed means it's a slush fund, but really, I think, Véronique, you know this, if you didn't have the space when you were still at IED, you couldn't have done these RTEs in the right way unless you had the fiscal space, if you like, using IMF terms, to get on with this. And the last thing I wanted to say was that both Charles and Gabriele mentioned, look, at the end of the day, even if we do these real-time evaluations or rapid assessments of ongoing activities, that gives us room. We still have to do the real evaluations after they're finished and they're completed. And it's actually going to be interesting to see whether or not, having done real-time evaluations, our ultimate evaluations will be better as a result. And I don't quite know the answer to that yet. Back to you, Véronique.
Thank you very much, Manny. It's definitely a lot of thoughts for us to explore, but definitely the difference between monitoring and evaluation. Are we making the frontiers a bit blurb, and whose responsibility it is to do this type of evaluation? That's really also an important point. I will turn to Megan now. And Megan, I will ask you to reflect also on your experience of the global coalition, the global evaluation coalition. But looking forward, it's definitely a great experience. It was, I think, the first time that such an initiative was taken. And you wonder also how this experience could maybe inspire future experience, maybe not exactly the same, but similarly. And of course, I have in mind the ongoing climate change crisis. So is there something that you think could be done there, or what should we try not to do so that we actually don't do harm? So it's to you, Megan.
Yeah, thank you. And it is something that we're actively exploring both within the Secretariat, but also with our partners in the coalition. And I think there will come a time when the main focus of the evaluative work on COVID does come to a natural close. Of course, as you all are aware, the data issues are huge. So we don't even have good, reliable data on the input side, as in how much money was spent in different aspects of the response for 2021 yet. So there is a long tail, I guess, to say, to this crisis, and we expect evaluative work to continue for several more years. That being said, I really agree that there is a need to pick up the baton on climate, the existential climate crisis. And some thoughts that I have, I mean, I already shared my sort of key takeaway lessons, but this idea that we can sort of take a mandate rather than just be given the mandates of our own institutions. And that could be around issues such as coherence. Policy coherence for development, of course, is a key area around sustainable development supports, being able to achieve poverty and hunger goals from the SDGs, while also reducing the carbon footprint or the pollution footprint. So, there's ways in which I think this idea maybe could serve as inspiration. I think continuing to explore and take lessons from what worked well, and how can we work together? How can we share and take examples? And then finally, I think that the reality, I was just starting to respond to the question from Merwin in Philippines. I mean, the reality is that what really matters in terms of climate, but also what really matters in terms of sustainable development more broadly, is what's happening within national development policy making. And international development cooperation is only and has only ever been a piece of that picture. And so actually looking at the mandate to evaluate national policies and support accountability for the impacts of different relevant policies is really important. So that is one thing that I really would not want to lose in the COVID coalition, is the fact that the Prime Minister's Office of Uganda Evaluation Unit is on the same footing as the Asian Development Bank's Independent Evaluation Office or the independent evaluation of the Agence Française de Développement. That's, I think, really important, and that is only even more strongly reflected in the climate crisis, that we need to focus also on the domestic accountability and the domestic policymaking sphere, and then look at how international partners are supporting it, but try to get away from this very development cooperation centric perspective that actually skews our focus to some degree and is a bit over evaluated compared to other areas that are really important. So I think it's really exciting to see, for example, some of the presentations during Asian Evaluation Week from the government of China about their own efforts on monitoring and evaluating their different efforts at decarbonization of the Chinese power sector, for example. So that's very exciting for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Megan. And maybe I'll stay with you with some of the questions from the audience, because there is one question that's specifically on the OECD evaluation criteria. So of course, you are the one who can respond directly, but then of course, others can come. Would you like to take that question? Do you want me to repeat it? Yes.
No, I think there were several questions. I mean, yes, of course, people have different views about the criteria. A little known reality is that we don't impose the criteria on anyone, even our own members. We don't have the status or the ability to impose them. So their widespread use reflects the fact that many evaluation units find them to be a helpful way of guiding their key evaluation questions. But they are, as I said in the written answer, they're just one small piece, and actually some might argue not all that important compared to other aspects of evaluation, including ethical principles, quality standards, evaluation methods. So it's quite interesting to reflect on how the evaluation criteria were used or were used differently and adapted during the pandemic crisis. I think that's really interesting learning. And as I've mentioned before, we did publish new criteria definitions in 2019 and a guidance for their use that came out in 2021. So it's very much an ongoing learning discussion, and we would love to hear more from others that have ideas about how the criteria are or are not being applied in useful ways in the current context.
Thank you. And one of the new criteria, at least coherence, is definitely now starting to be even more relevant in the context of this crisis and of the initiative. Maybe I'll go to the question on the real-time evaluations. And there is one question, question 5, which is, for IMF and others, so after the fact, the fact that we've used it, shouldn't we always do real-time evaluation? I think we started responding already in the discussion, but what would you say about it, about having only real-time evaluation so that we can correct mistakes sooner? Maybe Charles and then Manny, and then I will ask you, Eva, to give your perspective from board members too.
Thanks, Véronique. I mean, as I was saying before, from our perspective, our comparative advantage and value added is by giving deeper, broader reflections that are holistic and look, from at the higher level interactions among the various components of the fund, the lending framework, the budgetary framework, the HR framework, rather than getting into the details of individual procedures. And I mean, if we tried to do the latter, that would take our resources. It would also take resources from staff. And there is a concern at the fund, perhaps more than elsewhere, that the evaluator should not risk the potential for interfering with lending operations. In fact, in our terms of reference, it explicitly says that we should not interfere with current operations. And there's been a lot of debate about exactly what that means and why it's there. But even if it weren't there, I think our general philosophy is that the value added that we bring to the institution is more from the deeper, more reflective evaluations rather than the tighter, more procedural oriented real-time evaluations.
Thank you, Charles. And actually, Manny, you go even further because you raised already in your response earlier the point of, is it really the role for independent evaluation or is it more for management to do it? Would you like to elaborate?
Yeah, and really, Charles said it. There's even a danger, I think, that if that's all we did, then the whole notion of independence becomes a little bit of a question mark, because in the end, the line or between the evaluation or the analysis and the action becomes very short. And then to what extent are you not part of operations anymore? The other is, at some point, I assume our owners will actually want to know what the outcomes have been, which we can't address in a real-time evaluation. And for that, you need that reflective value added that Charles mentioned. So I do think that it's really tempting, because I have heard people say, wow, you did these useful reports and they were cheaper and they were more timely. How could you not do this? And I think it really requires sort of real reflection to see that you need all parts. And I do think that we as independent evaluators did have a role in producing these real-time evaluations. I think that independence itself gave comfort to board and management that they were on the right track, as I mentioned earlier. And we just want to make sure we don't lose that cachet of independence. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Manny. Eva, your perspective from as a board member.
Thanks, Véronique. Yeah, I looked very carefully at the questions in the chat. So both question 5 and 7 is a little bit attached to it. I must say that already in my second intervention, I was talking about the trade-offs and the important balances you have to strike here when it comes to how much you as an independent evaluator should be involved in rapid assessments. From a board perspective, we got very spoiled and very pleased with what we got in terms of rapid assessment of the COVID crisis package. And I do think here, when it comes to crisis measures and when you're in very uncharted territories, it is a comfort for the board to have the independent evaluator involved. But you should be careful until you are saying that you should always have a rapid assessment of whatever you are doing, because then you have to think about what Manny was already alluding to in his earlier intervention and came back to now. That is to say the role of the self-evaluation team, or whatever you call them in your organization. So you see that you are using management resources in the careful way as well. So not in order not for the independent evaluator to get trapped in those trade-offs and make it difficult for you to have your accountability role and so on. But indeed, I do think, unfortunately, we have a lot of expectations of rapid assessments, be it from you or from the self-evaluation units. And they might indeed need to step up. The first ones taking the baton in the EBRD, of course, was the evaluation department, and that's why we are looking to you, of course. But here is a real discussion that we need to have ourselves on those gray zones. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Eva. It's, always, as I said earlier, it's always important that we have this discussion also between board members and independent evaluation to make sure that we are in the place where we should be, I have to say. Gabriele, if you don't mind, I'd like to turn to you also to ask you a few questions, because there have been some questions, were question 8, and I think maybe you, Manny, could respond to that. It's related to the rapid assessment done for the COVID-19 coalition and whether partner governments benefited from it, because we provide our evaluation to the board members and to management. So what about the governments and in our case also the private sector? And Manny, I will also ask you whether you felt that they might have also benefited from some of the lessons. I have to say, Gabriele, that it's a difficult question because we don't reach out to governments, but maybe that's actually something that you can highlight.
No, thank you, Véronique. I mean, to some extent, we reach government indirectly. So one of the elements of the key elements of the EBRD response to the COVID-19 was all the policy dialogue, the policy work around it. That is really part of the business model of the EBRD. And indeed, to some extent, the COVID-19 pandemic was a sort of stress test for the business model of the bank. And our rapid assessment was rigorous enough to provide some insight in this rapid advisory response framework that the EBRD really put in place in a record time, which really play a key role in supporting and bridging this gap that you were talking about between private sector in this difficult situation and government. And this is an area that in the second note, that's why when we are discussing about real-time evaluation, we need to really think that about a series of pieces, right? I mean, and we build on the knowledge that we get of each one, right? So in the second impact assessment or counterfactual analysis, we will explore much into depth this element of reaching through the policy work the government and what kind of interaction and dynamic is between the public and the private sector.
Thank you, Gabriele. Manny, and then maybe Megan, because Megan, you have actually maybe more experience with working directly even with governments on this. Manny?
As Gabriele mentioned, I think it is still a work in progress of what we know in terms of what governments react. Now, a couple of things. One is that, of course, our board members are government representatives. And their views, it was interesting, for example, in some respects, there were some different views between donor countries and non-donor countries on how these assessments were coming out, but they were having an impact through them. On the capitals directly, we can't answer that quite yet, except to say that our teams did reach out to some of these capitals in order to get an assessment of how the ADB was doing. And I think from that point of view, they got some insights that I hope was helpful to them.
Thank you. And thank you for the reminder that actually we report to the board, and through the board members, we report to the member countries directly. Megan, would you like to share your experience?
Yes, I mean, I think our experience is primarily around the use of evaluation within OECD governments, where you do see a whole range of discussions. And I think this relates to the question about real time and the role of evaluators. And for me, the question is yes, the answer would be yes, and. I mean, real time learning and evaluation is just one tool in the toolbox, and you have, you know, a whole range of considerations about who is actually carrying out work, the level of rigor and credibility of that work, the role of independence in ensuring credibility, but also the timing. So I don't think I'd ever want to pronounce on, you know, real-time evaluation is a good thing or it's a bad thing. I think it's sort of the classic example of, well, it depends. And I think you have to look at it in the context of who else is doing what in an institution. Do you have strong, you know, impact evaluation taking place embedded within the nutrition team or embedded within a health sector team where that's actually incorporated throughout the implementation? You know, evaluation units of the central independent evaluation unit kind of play a very specific role. And I think that is why historically they have not been as involved in the real-time kind of learning, exactly as you said, Véronique, because they have the luxury of having a slightly different value add. But that's not to downplay the fact that they can sometimes play. And I think we're seeing a lot of interesting evolution here about being more of an advisory role or a you know, sort of support role to those designing and implementing programs from the outset. And in terms of, I mean, government response, I think, you know, what we see is that it's really, you've all seen that sort of pyramid of evaluation capacity that goes from individual technical skills to institutional systems, policies and mechanisms, and then the enabling environment. And I think the enabling environment is, of course, hugely important. So what we've seen is that in countries where there's a strong civil society that has a lot of attention to the international development cooperation program, they will pick up on any especially negative finding in evaluation reports and pull it out. And call out their governments for wasting money or for spending money inefficiently, et cetera. And we've seen some examples where evaluation units are actually under pressure to be more critical in their findings, not less critical. So I think that enabling environment is a really key part about what factors allow governments to actually take seriously the findings in evaluation, especially when they're negative. And we have a major piece of work ongoing now that's reflecting upon lessons about learning and not learning from Afghanistan, that will look at actually how decisions were taken or not taken, reflecting on the huge body of evaluative literature coming out of Afghanistan over 20 years. So I hope we get into some more of these questions.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. Unfortunately, I think that we are really coming to the end of this session already. And I won't try to summarize everything. It was really intense and dense. There are a few points that came out that I think are really important because I think we have to keep in mind this word of caution about the role of independent evaluation. So it's still a work in progress. We need to really continue to reflect and think about our role and how we can strike the right balance. Definitely collaboration is something that needs to be enhanced. The need to continue to be agile and reactive. And we heard also from you, Eva, that there is a demand from the board side for this type of information, but it shouldn't be at the detriment of our core work. I will go around, not the table here, but the screen, and ask each one of you if you could just give one or two words or one sentence that for you is the key takeaway for this session, for the participants to bring back home. Who would like to start?
For me, I think do real-time evaluations, but be strategic about when to do it.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Megan?
I would say learn as you go and don't be afraid to evaluate your own evaluations and document the lessons that you learn from them.
And take the mandate if I hear you too. Charles?
I think the key takeaway for me for this session is the importance of learning from each other as we all face similar challenges and similar goals. So I really appreciate you organizing this session, but also for all of the work that my fellow evaluation officers have been doing over the past couple of years in this area, and willingness to share and combine experiences. I think it's been a great experience, and hopefully we can learn from this and build on it going forward.
Thank you very much, Charles. Gabriele, and then I'll finish with you, Eva.
It's good I come after Charles. I mean, I wanted to say exactly the same things, but as being a Beatles fan, let me say that the key point for me is all together. It's a very famous Beatles song, but the point is in a structured way. So in revamping the ECG criteria for the private sector, that is the right focus for me to develop these new products of real-time assessment and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriele. So Eva, you have the word of the last word, representing the governments, at least yours.
Thank you, Véronique. And I think you all summarized it very well in your snappy sentences or words. And I have a longer, less snappy one, which is actually what I started off my whole reflection before this meeting, actually, or this session, this great session. And this, my belief is still that smart, rapid assessments will lead to smarter and much better informed decisions, particularly when time is of essence and in the urgent crisis where we are actually in uncharted territories.
Thank you very much for this really insightful discussion. I would end just with more thanks, and I would like to thank definitely each one of you, the panelists, Eva, Megan, Charles, Manny, and Gabriele, for taking the time and for really sharing very informative insights. I would like also to thank the organizers, and Manny, you are both a panelist and an organizer, so thank you very much, IED, for organizing that. And I know that the Deputy Director General also, Sona Sheta, is also behind this organization. So I'd like to thank her and the whole AEW team. And we have, we have Sonia, Mayan, Twinkle, Jillian, Connie, Karina. I'd like to thank them all for their work. On our side, also behind the scene, we have Theo and Natalia, who have been very, very helpful. So thanks, everybody. I hope I'm not missing anyone, but I know that there are much more people to thank, but really thank you very much. And thank you to AFDI and the Ministry of Finance of the People's Republic of China also for this great partnership. Thanks to all. And I hope it will be in person next year.